The wind cut lightly across the open courtyard of the academy grounds, stirring the flags that lined the far fence and making their ropes clink gently against the metal poles. Cadets marched in cadence somewhere out of sight, their boots hitting pavement like distant thunder, precise and steady. But on the far edge of the memorial wall, no one stood at attention. No eyes turned. No orders were called. Only one man stood there. He didn't wear a full uniform, only the jacket. Faded, olive green, sun-bleached around the seams. It hung too loose now, the shoulders too wide, the sleeves just a bit too long. One decoration rested over his heart, a silver star, dulled by time, its ribbon frayed and soft. His shoes were polished, but the polish had worn thin on the toes. He didn't stand proud. He stood present, quiet. Walter Granger, 84, shifted his weight slightly, careful not to let his knee lock again. He carried no cane. That was deliberate. He refused to let the years declare themselves too loudly. His hands, clasped behind his back, trembled with age, but not with fear. He stared at the names carved into the wall, not reading, just remembering. Cadets passed behind him in small knots, laughing, chatting, adjusting dress caps. A few gave him a glance. None stopped. A couple of visitors snapped photos of the wall from a respectful distance. No one noticed the old man standing just close enough to be part of the landscape, but not the story. Walter didn't mind. He hadn't come to be seen. A folded flag sat on the bench nearby, wrapped in a clean cloth, resting like a sacred thing. It wasn't his. It belonged to Private Dale Klein, a name etched 5 panels over, bottom row. Walter came every year to sit with Dale, say nothing, just be there, the same way Dale had been, that night in the valley. Today, though, even the silence felt different, colder. The academy had changed. Fewer people remembered the old stories. Most who did were long gone. There were banners strung across the quadrangle, legacy through leadership, and tables set with coffee urns and brochures. Some kind of event was being prepared. Walter wasn't invited. He walked along the wall slowly. A brass band warmed up across the lawn, trumpets, snare drums, the low groan of tuning tubas. Familiar music, unfamiliar ceremony. He paused when he reached the plaque for the Korean War, short, efficient, lacking the ornament of more recent conflicts. Just dates, just names. Footsteps approached from behind, fast, young, unaware. A group of cadets swept by him, the shoulder of one brushing his arm. The cadet didn't notice, didn't look back. Walter staggered just slightly, righted himself, and exhaled slowly through his nose. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this section's reserved for ceremony guests," said a young officer approaching from the far side. His voice was polite, his tone gentle, but it was clear. Walter didn't look like he belonged. Walter nodded. "I understand." He turned and walked back to the bench, lowered himself slowly, carefully. The flag beside him waited. His medal rested under his coat like a heartbeat. He didn't need the seat of honor. He just wanted to see the wall. That was all. And maybe to be seen, just once more. The wind shifted again, carrying the sound of laughter from the main lawn. A bugle played a few slow notes. Walter closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, snow, blood, barbed wire, the sound of his friend's breath slowing in the dark. The final words, "Don't let him forget us." He opened his eyes and looked again at the wall. He didn't cry, but something deeper stirred, something hollow and waiting. And then, footsteps approached again, slower this time. He didn't turn, not yet, but he felt it, a pause, a presence, and then, the click of boots stopping just behind him, the weight of silence, the shift of air when someone recognizes something sacred. He turned. A young Marine cadet was staring at the medal, not in confusion, in recognition. Eyes wide, posture squared. "Sir, were you with Recon Bravo?" Walter blinked. That voice, that question, that name, and in that single breath, everything that had been quiet for too long started to rise. The question hung in the air, simple but charged. "Sir, were you with Recon Bravo?" Walter looked up at the young Marine, searching his face. The boy couldn't have been more than 21, square-jawed, sharp eyes, posture tight even at ease. His haircut was fresh, uniform perfectly fitted. But it wasn't the discipline that struck Walter. It was the tone. Not curiosity, not politeness, reverence. "I was," Walter replied, his voice dry with disuse. "Long time ago." The Marine nodded, then dropped into a clean, practiced salute. A few heads nearby turned at the movement, confused by the gesture. No one else had saluted today. Walter stared at the young man's hand, then slowly stood. His legs complained, but he stood anyway. He didn't return the salute with textbook precision. His fingers wavered slightly. But the Marine didn't lower his hand until Walter's was raised. They held the gesture for 3 seconds, maybe 4, then both lowered their arms. "My grandfather told me stories," the cadet said. "He was in logistics. Said there were scouts in Korea who didn't just gather intel. Said some of them were the reason whole units made it back alive." Walter nodded. "I remember them, and the ones who didn't make it." The Marine glanced down at the medal, then to the folded flag beside the bench. "Is that?" "A friend," Walter said. "His name's on the wall." He turned toward the stone and pointed to the far left panel. "Dale Klein. And over there." He shifted his hand 2 sections over. "Victor Hale. We were 3 on patrol. Came back as 1. The Marine said nothing, just looked at the wall as if trying to picture their faces. His breathing slowed. Behind him, the brass band began its warm-up again. Another officer called out commands to a group across the lawn. The moment should have broken. It didn't. "May I sit?" the Marine asked. Walter gestured to the bench. Plenty of room. They sat in silence. The kind of silence that only lives between generations. Not empty, but respectful. The kind that carries weight without speaking it. Across the courtyard, the ceremony was beginning. A colonel stepped up to the podium. Applause rippled through the seated crowd. A woman handed out pamphlets detailing the day's agenda. Cadet recognition, guest speeches, awards for current service members. Nothing about the past. Nothing about the wall. The Marine opened one of the pamphlets and scanned it quickly. His jaw tightened. "They didn't include Korea," he said softly. Walter smiled faintly. "They usually don't." A family walked by, pausing at the wall. One of the children tugged her father's arm, pointing to the medals on Walter's jacket. The father glanced briefly, gave a polite smile, and guided her along. "Come on, honey. Let's get to the seating area." The Marine watched them go, then turned back to Walter. "Sir, do you come here every year?" "I do." "They know that?" "No," Walter said. "They don't." Another round of applause came from the main lawn. A speaker began describing the achievements of a recently commissioned officer. Deployments, drone campaigns, leadership initiatives. Walter listened without judgment, but he didn't smile. The Marine leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands folded. "Would you ever speak? About what happened? About your team?" Walter stared ahead, unmoving. "Maybe," he said, "but only if someone remembers to ask." From the podium, the next name was announced. People clapped. The band played softly, and behind the wall, beneath a quiet flag and fading sky, 2 men sat, one young, one old, holding a space that ceremony had forgotten, but history never had. The applause faded like distant rain, drifting back into the drone of routine ceremony. Walter didn't turn to watch. He'd heard those kinds of introductions before, polished, professional, built for the moment. But they never lasted, not like names on stone. The Marine beside him said nothing, but Walter could feel the boy's attention settle on his chest. On the silver star, the ribbon pale now, its colors muted from sun and time. The edges of the medal had dulled, fine scratches mapping the years. Walter glanced down at it and gently pressed it flat with his hand, as if to keep it in place. "They send it in a box," he murmured. "No ceremony, no words. Just arrived one day. in the same mailbag as a Sears catalog. The Marine looked at him, eyes flickering. Walter smiled faintly. Didn't feel like it belonged. Still doesn't some days. From across the courtyard, another voice echoed through the speaker system, this time recounting a humanitarian mission from the last decade. Walter didn't fault them. Service came in all forms. But still, there was something heavy in the absence. "Sir," the Marine said, voice careful. "You were at Huangji Valley?" Walter nodded slowly. "February, 1952. That was the day we stopped calling it a hill and started calling it a trap." He could still see it. The deep snow, the blinding flares, the echo of machine guns hidden beneath the ridgeline. The quiet before it broke loose. "They called us ghosts after that," he said, rubbing the back of his hand, "because we came back from places that swallowed most." The Marine didn't blink. He leaned in, not out of shock, but out of reverence. "Sir," he said again, softer this time, "they mention you in one of the old training modules. Said Recon Bravo had no business surviving that ambush, that someone dragged 2 men back under fire with a leg full of metal." Walter gave a quiet laugh. "They never mentioned Dale or Victor, just me. But I only got out because Dale stood in the open and drew the fire." The folded flag beside him caught a gust of wind and shifted slightly. Walter reached to settle it. "I've been coming here to sit with him every year," he said. 36 years now. He's always in the same place. The academy moved on. So did the world. A group of cadets walked past. One of them glanced at Walter, then whispered something to another. The other shrugged. Neither stopped. The Marine watched them go, face still, lips pressed tight. "Sir," he said, "would you want to be introduced to the group?" Walter looked at him, thoughtful. "I didn't come for them," he said, "but I wouldn't mind being seen." The band picked up again, a light march trailing from across the lawn. Walter turned toward the sound, eyes shaded by the brim of his old cap. He remembered the sound of a different march, one played not by a band, but by boots sinking into snow and dirt and blood, the kind of music they don't teach anymore, the kind that never truly ends. Across the main lawn, rows of white chairs were filling up. Parents held programs folded across their laps. Cadets adjusted collar pins and whispered reminders about posture. On the stage, a decorated colonel finished his speech with polished gravity, pausing for applause that arrived right on cue. Walter sat still on the bench, one hand resting gently on the folded flag, the other absent-mindedly rubbing a line into the side of his pant leg, a habit from years of stillness during roll call, when silence was an armor and movement meant fear. He didn't see the officer approach. The footsteps were soft, practiced. The man was tall, mid-40s, clean-pressed and polished. His ribbons gleamed in the sunlight. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, smiling. "Are you here with one of the families? The reserved section's over there if you're looking for the tour." Walter turned his head, eyes steady. He looked at the man, then at the seating area, then back again. "No," he said gently. "I'm here for them." His hand gestured toward the wall, toward Dale's name and the others beside it. The officer paused, not out of rudeness, but confusion. He offered a shallow nod, the kind you give when you're not quite sure what someone means, but you don't want to offend. "Understood, sir," he said. "Enjoy the ceremony." He turned and walked off. The Marine shifted beside Walter. His mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing to say, nothing that would have mattered just then. Another cadet nearby chuckled, pointing discreetly in Walter's direction. "Why's that guy just sitting there?" he asked his friend, who shrugged and replied, "Maybe he wandered off from the veterans' booth." Walter didn't react. He'd heard worse in his life, much worse. Instead, he breathed in deeply. The spring air carried a mix of cut grass and hot metal. Somewhere nearby, someone lit a cigarette despite the rules. The scent caught in Walter's throat and pulled him back to a different time. Gun oil, snow, blood, cordite. He closed his eyes and sat with it. Not because he wanted to remember, but because forgetting meant dishonoring what was buried inside the memory. The Marine leaned in again. "I think they need to know who you are, sir." Walter smiled faintly. "They'll figure it out, or they won't." He reached up and adjusted his cap. "I used to think legacy was about names on stone," he said. "Turns out it's more about the people who care to look." The Marine nodded, jaw tight. Not with anger, but with something else. A fire beginning. "Then maybe I can help them look." Walter turned to him, surprised. The boy's eyes were already scanning the crowd. And for the first time that day, Walter felt something shift. Not in the crowd, not in the program, but in one young voice ready to speak. The young Marine stood. He didn't rush, didn't bark commands, didn't demand attention. He simply rose from the bench with the same quiet precision he'd used 100 times before. Not for spectacle, but for honor. Walter glanced up at him, brows lifting slightly. The Marine offered a respectful nod, then stepped forward, turning toward the crowd. The brass band had just finished a rendition of Eternal Father, and the announcer was beginning to introduce the next speaker, a retired general preparing to take the stage. His name echoed through the speakers. Applause followed. All eyes were forward, except one pair. The Marine stood just beside the wall, spine straight, chest out, and with a sharp, deliberate motion he raised his right hand in salute. Not to the speaker, not to the stage, but to Walter. Walter froze. For a beat, nothing happened. The gesture hung in the air like a stone thrown into still water. No splash yet, just the moment before the ripple. Then someone noticed. A cadet in the second row turned. Then another. Whispers began. The photographer lowered his camera. One of the Academy officials glanced behind him, brows furrowing at the unexpected break in formation. And still, the Marine saluted, eyes now turning toward the source of the stillness. Walter shifted in his seat. His body knew the motion before he could think. Slowly, he rose, knees protesting, and faced the young man. His right hand came up in reply. Not a flawless salute. Not fast, but full of every step he had taken to make it to that moment. Two hands held still in the air, generations apart, but tethered by something timeless. The announcer's voice faltered in the microphone. A moment later, a murmur rippled through the seating area. Someone whispered, "That's Walter Granger." Another followed. "Isn't he the one from the old recon unit?" A third, softer still. "I thought he was dead." The general on stage paused mid-step, eyes narrowing to the scene unfolding near the memorial wall. One cadet stood, then another. They didn't know why yet, but they knew what respect looked like. Walter and the Marine lowered their salutes in unison. The Marine stepped aside and turned toward the stage. "Permission to speak, sir," he called, his voice clear and crisp. The general on stage blinked. "Granted." "This man is PFC Walter Granger," the Marine said. "Recon Bravo, Korean War, Silver Star, and he's been coming here every year, without a single invitation." Silence. All the noise of the academy, the movement, the order, stopped. Walter stood still, eyes lowered slightly. He didn't want a spectacle, but this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the men whose names were on the wall, and the living proof that they were never truly forgotten. Walter didn't step forward right away. He stood where he was, hands at his sides, the faint rustle of the spring wind brushing past his jacket. The Marine waited beside him, eyes ahead, unwavering. And across the courtyard, 100 people who hadn't noticed him all morning now stood still, some out of confusion, others already feeling the weight settle in their chests. A senior officer approached from the stage, not rushed, not hesitant, just measured, like someone realizing they were standing on sacred ground without knowing it. "Sir," the officer said to Walter, his voice gentler than before, "if you're willing, the floor is yours." Walter looked at him, unsure. He hadn't spoken in front of a crowd since his discharge. He never wanted to. Stories about Dale and Victor weren't meant for ceremony. They were meant for memory. But something about the Marine beside him, and the silence that had fallen over the academy, told him this moment wasn't about stage lights or titles. It was about names. He stepped forward slowly. The podium was adjusted downward for his height. A cadet offered a hand as he climbed the single step. Walter waved it off, then nodded in thanks. He looked out over the gathering. Rows of uniforms, faces young and old, every set of eyes locked on him. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't read from notes. He just spoke. "My name is Walter Granger," he began. "I was with Recon Bravo in Korea, 1952. A beat of silence. "I don't have a speech. I didn't come here for one. I come here each year for two names." He turned toward the wall and pointed gently. "Private Dale Klein, Private Victor Hale. My brothers. We walked together, laughed together, froze together." The wind caught his voice slightly, but it held. "On February 12th, we walked into a valley we shouldn't have come out of. But I did, because Dale drew fire, because Victor threw his weight against me when I slipped, because they believed that if just one of us made it home, it was worth it." He turned back to the crowd. "They're the reason I come. They're why I wear this medal. And they're why I stayed quiet for a long time." The silence deepened. Walter's hands trembled slightly. His voice didn't. "Don't just remember names on walls. Ask who stood next to them, who held them when they bled, who wrote letters for them when they couldn't hold a pen." He paused, looked at the Marine, "and thank the ones who still ask." He stepped down without waiting for applause. None came. But as he returned to his seat, every head rose in salute, not because they were told, but because something sacred had just been spoken aloud. For the first time, Walter didn't sit alone. Walter eased himself down onto the bench once more. But this time, the silence around him wasn't hollow. It was reverent, weighted, the kind of silence that listens, not forgets. The young Marine took his place beside him again, his uniform now slightly wrinkled from movement, but his bearing unchanged. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The way he sat, straight-backed, close but not crowding, said everything. One by one, cadets approached. Some offered soft salutes. Others nodded, eyes wide with new understanding. None asked for selfies. No one fumbled for phones. They came as learners, not spectators. Walter received each gesture with the quiet grace of someone unaccustomed to attention, but deeply familiar with dignity. When a young woman, second-year cadet by her stripes, knelt briefly beside him and whispered, "Thank you," he touched the brim of his cap and gave a nod that felt like a blessing. The folded flag beside him no longer sat untouched. An officer carefully picked it up and carried it with both hands toward the Academy's historical wing. Walter watched in silence as it disappeared through the main doors, knowing it would now rest beneath glass, not for display, but for remembrance. A plaque would be placed beside it. PFC Walter Granger, and the men who walked beside him. It wasn't for Walter. It was for Dale, for Victor, for all those whose stories never made it into programs or headlines. At the far end of the courtyard, the brass band resumed, not with a march, but with taps, a single bugle rising over still shoulders and bowed heads. Walter removed his cap. The sound pierced deeper than any speech. Not sadness, something fuller, something eternal. When the last note faded, Walter leaned slightly toward the Marine. "Thanks for seeing me," the Marine answered without hesitation. "We all saw you, sir. We just didn't know it was you." Walter chuckled softly. "That's how ghosts work, son. Seen but forgotten." The Marine turned, meeting his eyes. "Not anymore." And just like that, the bench beside the wall was no longer a place for waiting. It had become a seat of honor. Snow. So much snow. Not the soft kind that fell on porches in winter postcards. This was the bitter snow, jagged, dry, wind-carved. The kind that burned the lungs and turned blood to shadow. February 1952. Huangji Valley. Walter could still feel the sting of it in his fingertips, even now. The wind had teeth back then, and yet the cold hadn't been the worst part. It was the silence that came after the firing stopped. In the memory, Walter lay half buried beside a dead tree stump, his legs shredded by shrapnel, body twisted around the weight of another man. Victor, unconscious, heavy. The air reeked of gunpowder and sweat. A crimson trail marked every foot they had crawled. "Walt?" A voice behind him. Not from the present, from the memory. Dale's voice. Faint, raspy, already fading. "I'm hit bad, brother. You go." Walter's throat burned. "Not leaving either of you." Footsteps had cracked behind them, not friendly ones. Enemy scouts, sweeping the ridge. Walter had pulled Victor under a broken canvas tarp, covered his mouth, waited. Dale had stayed exposed, just long enough. He never spoke again after that, but the look in his eyes, steady, accepting, had been louder than anything Walter had heard before or since. "I've got you," Walter had whispered to Victor, and in that instant, something had broken open inside him. Not fear, not panic, duty, a sacred kind. The kind that doesn't demand medals, it just acts. The sound of boots had passed, silence returned, and then only snow. Walter blinked. He was back on the bench. The wind today was warm, the flags above rustled gently. But in his mind, Dale's final whisper echoed again. "Don't let him forget us." He looked down at his hands. Old now, wrinkled, still trembling slightly. He hadn't forgotten, not ever. And now, finally, someone else hadn't either. They came quietly, one by one. Cadets who had laughed earlier. Officers who'd walked past without a second glance. Even the photographer, the same man who had captured staged smiles all morning, now lowered his camera and simply stood still. No orders had been given, no announcements made, and yet a semicircle began to form around the bench by the wall. Not tight, not invasive, just present. The young Marine remained seated beside Walter, hands folded, watching as reverence filled the space like rising tidewater. It didn't rush in. It swelled. Slow, deep, undeniable. One cadet, maybe 18, barely a year in uniform, stepped forward. His cheeks were still pink with the rush of the morning, his boots a little too new. He swallowed hard before he spoke. "Sir," he said, "my grandfather used to talk about Korea. I never really listened. But today," he paused, blinking fast, "today I heard something I won't forget." Walter nodded once, his expression soft. "It's never too late to listen." Another cadet followed, then two more. One placed a hand gently on the folded flag's empty stand, the glass plaque not yet mounted. No one asked questions. They just honored. Walter watched them. He didn't feel pride exactly. It wasn't about himself. What stirred in him was deeper, older, recognition, not for the man, but for the meaning. The band had packed up. The crowd from the official ceremony had largely dispersed, but the real event was happening here, off-program, unplanned. A moment born not of planning or publicity, but of a young Marine noticing what others did not. That's all it took. One pair of eyes that still saw duty. One gesture of respect. Walter turned to the Marine. "What's your name, son?" "Cadet First Class Noah Reyes, sir." "You got someone in the Corps?" "No, sir. Just felt like I should know where I come from." Walter gave a dry chuckle. "Then you've already got more than most." Reyes hesitated, then stood. He adjusted his collar and stepped in front of the gathering crowd. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This man is not just a veteran," he said. "He is a story that was nearly lost, a piece of our history left outside the program." He turned back to Walter. "On behalf of all of us, thank you for still showing up." Walter didn't speak. His eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. He just bowed his head. And when he looked back up, even the ones who hadn't known his name stood straighter, because now they did. The young don't always forget. Sometimes they remember just in time. Today we remember. Always forward. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor, sacrifice, and quiet courage. Let us know where you're watching from, And comment below to honor a veteran or silent hero in your life. The best way to preserve their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another forgotten chapter of Valor, one story at a time.